So, today's message is called Seeds. During springtime and summertime, we're planting things, we're growing things. At home, I have a couple of raised planter gardens that we use and grow beets and radishes and different kinds of peppers. It's a really encouraging time to see growth. And so, as a result, while I was away, I was thinking about the springtime and the summertime and seeds. And that's why I came up with the message that I did today. And it's taken from Isaiah, the Old Testament book, chapter 53, verses 1 through 3. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. If you really want to see a miracle in front of your eyes, take a seed the size of maybe a freckle on your face, put it under several inches of dirt, give it plenty of water, give it light, maybe give it a little fertilizer, and then get ready. Because a little seed can move mountains. It doesn't matter that the ground above it weighs 1,000 times the weight of that seed, maybe even thousands of times the weight of that particular seed. The seed has the ability to push it back. And every spring and every summer, dreamers from all around the world plant tiny hopes in overturned soil. And every spring and every summer, their hopes press against these impossible odds and explode into a bloom. Never, church, underestimate the power of a seed. Now, as far as I know, the writer of the New Testament book of James, the book that has his name after it, I don't think James was a farmer, because he was, after all, the half-brother of Jesus Christ. So maybe, because Jesus grew up as a carpenter, maybe James was a carpenter too. But regardless of James's profession, he knew the power of a seed sown in fertile soil. Because here's what he said in James chapter 3, verse 18. Those who are peacemakers will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of goodness. And the principle for peace is the same as the principle for any crop that you might sow by use of a seed. Never, ever underestimate the power of a seed. And I want to use as an example for you the story of a guy by the name of Heinz, like Heinz ketchup. And I want you to picture Europe in 1934. Hitler's plague of anti-Semitism has infected an entire continent. Some would escape it. Some, unfortunately, would die from it. But 11-year-old Heinz would learn from it. He would learn the very valuable lesson of sowing seeds of peace. Heinz was a young Jewish boy in Hitler's Europe at that time, and he lived in the Bavarian village of Fürth. And Fürth, unfortunately, was in the process of being overrun by Hitler's youth thugs. Heinz's father, who was a school teacher, had lost his job. All recreational activities had come to an end. Tension was mounting on the streets, and Jewish families clutched to their traditions that held them together as a community. I mean, the observance of the Sabbath, the observance of Rosh Hashanah, the observance of Yom Kippur. These things were very important to the Jewish people, and they took on now a very new significance. And as this storm of persecution blackened and then swelled in the first community and elsewhere, these ancient observances were a very precious cleft in a very mighty rock. And as the streets became a battleground, that kind of security for the Jewish people at that time meant survival. So Hitler Youth were roaming the neighborhoods, just looking for trouble. And young Heinz learned very early on to walk through life with his eyes wide open. And when he saw a band of these troublemakers, he would go to the other side of the street to avoid having any contact with them whatsoever. And sometimes he would escape a fight. Sometimes he would escape a confrontation, and sometimes not. And one day in 1934, a pivotal confrontation occurred with Heinz. Heinz had found himself now face to face with a Hitler bully, and for Heinz, he believed a beating appeared to be absolutely inevitable. This time, however, Heinz was able to walk away unhurt. Not because of what Heinz did, but because of what Heinz said. He didn't fight back. He spoke up. He convinced the troublemakers that a fight was completely unnecessary. In other words, Heinz's words kept a battle at bay. And Heinz saw firsthand then, as an 11-year-old boy, how a word can actually bring about peace. He learned that skill, and he learned the skill of using words to avoid conflict. And for a young Jewish boy in Hitler-infested Europe, that skill had many opportunities to be honed and to be perfected. Fortunately, Heinz's family escaped from Bavaria, and they made their way to the United States of America. And later in life, Heinz would downplay the impact of those adolescent experiences that he had had as they related to his ongoing development as an adult. But it makes you wonder, because after Heinz grew up, his name became synonymous with peace negotiations. His legacy became that of a bridge builder. Somewhere, he had learned that the power of a properly placed word can bring about peace. And you have to wonder sometimes if this training didn't initially come from the streets of Fürth, Bavaria, Germany. But you probably don't know him as Heinz. You probably know him by his anglicized name. His name is Henry, as in Henry Kissinger. Never underestimate the power of a seed. So the question for all of us is, how good are you, how good am I at sowing seeds of peace? I mean, you may not be called on like Henry Kissinger to stave off some sort of international conflict, but you will have the opportunity to do something that's even more vital than that, to bring inner peace to very troubled hearts. Now, Jesus modeled this, but interestingly, as you read through Jesus' life, you don't see Jesus settling a lot of conflicts. You don't see Jesus intervening in disputes between people or neighbors. What we do see is Jesus cultivating an inward harmony through acts of love. Washing the feet of men whom he knew were going to betray him, just like Alvin said this morning before the Lord's Supper. Having lunch with a corrupt tax official. Honoring the sinful woman whom society had completely scorned and thrown out. Jesus built bridges by healing hurts. He prevented conflict by touching the conflicted. He cultivated harmony by sowing seeds of peace in very fertile hearts. And I want you to pause for just a moment and think about the people in your world. And I want you to scroll through the gallery of faces that are significant to each of you in your lives. I want you to mentally flip through the picture of each and every one of them. Those with whom you probably deal most often. Can you see the faces of those people? Your spouse, maybe. Your best friend. Your golf buddies. Your kids. Your aunt that lives across the country. Your neighbor across the street. Maybe even a coworker. I want you for a minute to freeze frame those images while I'll tell you how some of them might be feeling. I went to my doctor not long ago for an annual checkup. And at my age, the doctor does stuff that I wasn't aware should even be done. As a result, my doctor ordered the works. And as a result, a nurse puts me on a table, sticks little cold suction cups to my chest. Another nurse wraps this heavy band around my arm and squeezes this black bulb until my arm starts to tingle. Then they pricked my finger and they told me to please go fill up a cup. Awkward is about the only adjective that I can describe for that. And then, with all of these preliminaries done, just to name a few, they put me in a room, tell me to take off my shirt and wait there for the doctor. There is something, church, about being poked, about being pushed, about being measured, about being drained that makes you feel a little bit like a head of lettuce in your local grocery store. I sat on this cold metal chair and I stared out the window and I waited. And I believe that somebody in your world feels that same way. The daily push and shove of the world has a way of leaving us worked over and worn out. Someone in that gallery of people I asked you to envision is sitting on a cold aluminum chair of insecurity. They're clutching the backside of a hospital gown for fear of exposing what little pride they might have left. And that person desperately, desperately needs a word of peace from you. Someone needs you to do for them what my doctor did for me. Now, my doctor is a small-town Filipino doctor that practices in the big city of San Diego. He still remembers names, and he probably keeps pictures of his patients that he's seen over the years on bulletin boards in his office. And though you know he's very busy, especially today, he makes you feel like you're the only patient he has. So after a bit of small talk and a few questions about my medical history, he put down my file, which is beginning to get larger and larger as the years go on, and said this to me: "Let me take my doctor's hat off for a moment and talk to you as a friend." Now, I've known my doctor for more than a quarter of a century. And our last chat lasted, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes at the most. Because he asked me about my family. He asked me about my workload. He asked me about my stress level. I mean, there was nothing profound in the questions that he was asking. There was nothing probing. He didn't go any deeper in his questioning than I would have allowed him. But I left convinced that if I had needed to take him down some dark path to maybe some pit in my life, he would have followed me there if I had wanted him to. After our chat, he then went about his job, tapping my knee with that rubber hammer that they have, staring down my throat, looking in my ears, listening to my chest. And when he was all done and I'm buttoning up my shirt, he took his doctor's hat off again and reminded me not to carry the world on my shoulders and to eat a few less potato chips. And then this is what he said: "And be sure to love your wife and those kids. Because when it all boils down to it, Randy, you're not much without them." And he walked out as quickly as he had walked in. That was a seed sower in a doctor's smock. So, church, do you want to see a miracle? Plant a word of love, heart deep in a person's life that you know. Nurture it with a smile. Fertilize it with a prayer. And watch what happens. An employee gets a compliment, let's say. A wife receives a bouquet of flowers. A cake is baked and carried next door to a neighbor. A widow is hugged. A gas station attendant is thanked and honored. Sowing seeds of peace is like sowing beans. I mean, you don't know how it works. All you know is that it does. Seeds are planted, and topsoils of hurt can be shoved away. Never, ever underestimate the power of a seed. And I say that with good authority because God didn't. When his kingdom was being ravaged and his people had forgotten his name, he planted his seed. When the soil of the human heart had grown crusty, he planted his seed. When religion had become a ritual and the temple a trading post, he planted his seed. Do you want to see a miracle? Then watch God as he places the seed of his own self in the fertile womb of a young Jewish girl. Up it grew from the Isaiah passage that we talked about, like a tender green shoot sprouting from a root in a dry and sterile ground. The stones of legalism that had burdened backs, the stones of oppression that had literally broken bones, the stones of prejudice that had fenced out needy people, all of them, every single one of them, was overturned and shoved aside by what? A seed. But it was that final stone that proved to be the supreme test of that particular seed. The stone of death. It had been rolled there by the people and had been sealed by Satan in front of that tomb. And for a moment, maybe for a moment, it appeared that the seed would be stuck in the earth forever. For a moment, it looked like the rock was too big to be budged. But then, somewhere in the heart of the earth, the seed of God stirred. It shoved, and then it sprouted. The ground trembled, the rock of the tomb tumbled, and lo and behold, the Easter lily blossomed. Don't ever underestimate the power of a seed, because you have no idea what you can do in sharing a word with someone who needs to hear that. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be a prepared sermon or message. All it has to be is a word of comfort, a word that says, I care. And then staying with it and praying with that person or praying for that person, but being involved in their life and sowing something so simple as an I love you, or I'm praying for you, or let me give you this verse which encourages me. Planting that seed, you have no idea what results it could lead to. But it has to start with you. One final note. I love the parable of the sower, and I've probably preached that parable on a number of occasions here over the past now decade. But one of the things that I find remarkable about the sower is the fact that he keeps sowing. If you recall, in that parable, when the sower first started sowing seed, birds came in and swooped in and stole the seed. And that sower could have yelled all sorts of profanity at the birds for stealing the seed. And if he had done that, what would he not be doing? Not sowing. But then he kept sowing. But then the seed fell onto some ground, and the seed sprouted very quickly. But then the weeds kind of grew up, and it was rocky soil. And the sower at that point of time could have added fertilizer, could have got his hoe, removed the rocks, and to provide a better culture and a better environment in which that seed could grow. But he didn't. He kept sowing. But then he fell into some other ground, and it was good ground, but it also had a bunch of rocks and weeds, and the sun had come out and hit certain spots and was wilting the plants. And the sower then could have put a tarp over it, could have put some fertilizer, some weed killer, could have sat under the tarp and sang to his seeds, encouraging them to grow, but he didn't. What did he do? He kept on sowing to the point where he finally got to the last good patch. But even the good patches of soil had different results. Some grew at like a 30% rate. Some grew at a 60% rate. Some doubled and grew at a 100% rate. And the sower could have stayed there and encouraged the 30%ers to be 100%ers. Could have encouraged the 60%ers to give it a go and be 120%ers. But he didn't. What did he do? He kept on sowing. And church, we are going to run into people in our lives that we want to chase the birds. We want to add the fertilizer. We want to remove the rocks. We want to till some furrow to make that person fertile. But what it really takes for us to do is to sow the seed. And how difficult is that? The parable of the sower gives you the idea that he reaches into his pack, kind of like Johnny Appleseed, right? And just starts throwing the seed. It's not that hard. But it does take commitment, and it does take patience, and it also takes doing. So this week, my challenge to you is, Sow the seed. Sow a kind word, a loving word, an encouraging word. It doesn't have to be complicated. Just do it. And in the doing of it, watch a miracle happen. So, hence the song that we were singing. Now, this has to do more with about going out and evangelizing than just sowing the seed, but it does ask the question, are you sowing the seed? Hopefully this week